Good evening. I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, president of the Salisbury Forum. For those of you who aren't familiar with the forum, we're based in Salisbury, Connecticut, and host nationally recognized speakers in free public forums. If you want to learn about our upcoming events, please go to our homepage, salisburyforum.org, and join our email list. You can also follow us on Facebook. If you or your friends miss one of our talks, they're available on our website under videos. Our next forum will be on November 19th, when Sherry Turkle will be talking about technology and empathy. She's the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self, and has spent her career examining the impact of technology on human relationships. We've just begun our annual fundraising campaign. I want to express our sincere thanks to everyone who has helped us bring so many great speakers to our community over the past 16 years. Many of you have probably already received a letter from us requesting a donation, along with probably every other nonprofit you know of. And since we rely on all of you to produce our programming and keep our talks free, we would be extremely grateful for any donation you might send our way. You can make a simple online donation right from our homepage if that's easier for you. We'll have a Q&A period at the end of the talk, so click on the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your screen to type in any questions you may have. I'll be reading them to our speaker after her talk. Please do not use the chat feature. There'll be a few poll questions popping up tonight. Once you respond to them, they'll disappear and the talk will continue. We're delighted to have Nicole Perlroth here with us tonight. She's a leading expert on cybersecurity and digital espionage. You may have seen Nicole's byline on articles about the alarming increase in ransomware attacks, from stealing data to disrupting the operations of our government, cities, and businesses. The situation is so severe that the Biden administration took action last month to crack down on the problem by expanding its use of sanctions to cut off digital payment systems that have allowed such criminal activity to flourish and threaten our national security. While most of us were struggling to manage the basic operations of our cell phones and computers, Nicole immersed herself for 7 years in the shadow world of computer hackers, cyber criminals, and international espionage. While that sounds like research for a new James Bond film, instead it led her to write her new book about the global cyberweapons arms race. This is how they tell me the world ends. I encourage you to support our favorite local independent bookstore by picking up a copy at Oblong Books in Mellerton, New York. It'll probably make a great holiday gift. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Nicole Perlroth to the Salisbury Forum.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Mary, and thank you to everyone else for joining what I'm sure is your 1000th Zoom webinar, perhaps, of this ongoing pandemic. So I thought I would just start by saying hello. I'm Nicole Perlroth. I've been covering cybersecurity at the New York Times for the last decade, although the word cybersecurity increasingly feels inadequate. I tell people that what I actually do is I cover digital espionage and digital sabotage. So with that, I think I'd like to just start with a poll question to get us all started. And that poll question is, how many of you have heard of Stuxnet? And you can go ahead and just click a yes or no. Okay, so the majority of you have never heard of it. That's a good thing. That means we have a lot to learn over the next hour or so. So Stuxnet was a piece of code that was developed by the United States and Israel. And the code was designed to break into Iran's Natanz nuclear facility, crawl across its network in search of the computers that control the speed of the rotors that spun Iran's uranium centrifuges. So probably the most fragile part of a nuclear weapons development program are the rotors of those centrifuges. They're brittle, they're fragile, and you really have to keep these uranium centrifuges spinning at just the right rate to enrich that uranium. And so what that code did was, in some cases, it spun up the rotors and then it sat back for 3 weeks and didn't do anything. And in some cases, it slowed them down to a trickle and then it would sit back again for 3 weeks. And all the while, if an Iranian engineer at Natanz was looking at their screen, everything appeared to be functioning completely normally. It had this sort of Ocean's 11 component to it. And the point of the program was to slowly destroy Iran's uranium supply over a period of months and then years, and to do it in a way that was designed to look like a natural accident. Because actually it's very normal for engineers at a uranium enrichment facility to have to throw away 10% of their uranium just due to natural accidents. So this attack was just designed to sort of catalyze those accidents over time so that the Iranians would be none the wiser. And what it really was a counter-proliferation effort. For years, Israel had been pressuring the United States to basically hand over the bunker buster bombs it needed to bomb Natanz. And this was during the George W. Bush term. This was during a second term. We were seeing an unprecedented number of soldiers come back in caskets from Iraq. We had no interest in getting into a third war in the Middle East. Every simulation the Pentagon had done that year, which was about 2006, 2007, showed that if we did hand Israel the bombs they needed to destroy Natanz, we would inevitably get dragged into World War III. And by that point, we were so overstretched in the Middle East, every simulation suggested that we might actually lose that war. So instead, the NSA came up with a clever pitch. It became Stuxnet, the code that would slowly destroy Iran's uranium supply over time and basically satisfy Israel so that they would get off our backs. And that is what we did. And in many ways, it was as brilliant as the Manhattan Project in reverse. This really was an effort to destroy any chance they had to get the uranium needed for a nuclear weapon. But unfortunately, sometime in 2010, that code got out. We don't know how it got out, but it got out of the building and it zoomed around the world. It hit hundreds of thousands of networks, including networks here in the United States, such as at Chevron. And actually, it looks like the code had been carefully designed with the general counsel standing over someone's shoulder, because it was designed so that it would only exact destruction on the exact configuration of computers that controlled those centrifuges at Natanz, and it would not detonate on any other system. So as it zoomed around the world, it would infect these systems, but it was like a mouse that would sniff this cheese and it wouldn't eat, is how some engineers have described it. And over time, as the forensics were done, every security researcher and nation state and anyone with skills started publishing their findings. And it was not long before they realized that this code had been designed to exact destruction at Natanz. So the year it was discovered was 2010. That was also about the time I started at the New York Times. And so really what I've been doing over the last decade is covering the post-Stuxnet era. Because what Stuxnet did is it did actually work. It did set back Iran's nuclear ambitions back years. It actually successfully destroyed a fifth of Iran's uranium supply. But once the cat was out of the bag, once people had a chance to examine this code, what they noticed was that this was the first time that code could be used not just for espionage, but for destruction. And that so long as you did so with code, you could potentially break into an adversary's nuclear plant and destroy their systems, in this case, their uranium supply. And you could do it without much in the form of consequences or repercussions. And so over the last 10 years, what we've seen is every country perhaps with the exception of Antarctica, although the other day someone added the Vatican to my list, has been developing their own stockpile of offensive cyber hacking tools, much of it for espionage, a lot of it for surveillance, and in many cases for destruction, for a rainy day when they might have to use code should the geopolitical conflict require it. So that has been the story of the last 10 years. At first, when I first started covering cybersecurity at the New York Times, there was this saying that some of you might have heard because it's been repeated over and over again. And the saying was this, it was that there's only two types of organizations left in the United States: organizations that know that they've been compromised and organizations that don't know they've been compromised yet. So when I joined the Times, I set out to find out whether this was true. And lo and behold, it appeared it was true. Most organizations in some way, shape, or form were learning that they had been breached or suffered some kind of security incident. But then what happened was very interesting. What happened was most companies would choose to bury these breaches, mostly out of fear of what their customers would say or their stock price or whether their reputation would suffer. But then something sort of fortuitous happened, which is my own employer, the New York Times, was hacked around 2012. We were hacked by a Chinese-backed hacking group who were in search of our sources. And for a period of about 6-7 months, I actually was able to embed with our security team at the Times and a little known startup at the time called Mandiant, and to a very minor extent with the FBI. As we watched the hacker, we began to call the Beijing summer intern, roll into the New York Times networks around 9 a.m. Beijing time and roll out around 5. In the beginning, we thought that they were actually looking to potentially shut down our printing press ahead of a major election that was coming up that year. But soon it became very clear based on their movements that they were after our sources for a couple stories that my colleagues had done in China about corruption in the Chinese ruling family. And what that was for me was really my business school graduate education in the state of cybersecurity in the United States today. It was the first time I realized, wow, American companies, journalists are now expected to defend themselves from advanced nation state-backed threats. And unfortunately, that has now been the case for the last 8-9 years. Organizations in the United States, every day in many cases, if they have IP of interest, or if they have infrastructure of interest, or that could be used in a battlefield conflict one day, are the targets almost every week of some kind of sophisticated cyber attack. So with China, we actually, after the Times was hacked, we went out and we actually were able to identify one of the PLA units that was responsible for thousands of these breaches on American companies. And we actually went out to the building in Shanghai where their headquarters was based. And we called out this group, and that led to a series of indictments of members of the PLA, and eventually actually an agreement in September 2015 between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama, whereby China basically agreed to cease hacking American organizations for their own commercial benefit. And that was huge because the main motivation security responders would see to these attacks was that China was actually, this was China's way of becoming a global innovator. No longer satisfied to be the world's manufacturer, they were determined to become a global innovator. And what is the quickest way to do that? It's to steal R&D from organizations that have spent 10, 20 years developing that R&D. And that is what they were doing in many cases that we were covering. After that agreement in 2015, we actually saw a huge drop-off in Chinese cyber espionage activity for a period of about 18 months until the Trump administration came in, essentially launched their trade war with China, and flipped the table over. And then we saw a huge reemergence of Chinese hacking activity. And we continue to see that today. Only when we first saw these Chinese cyber attacks back when the New York Times was hacked, Google was hacked, and other high-profile American organizations were breached, much of it was just done with spear phishing attacks. You know, these attacks that you hear about sometimes, where you get an email from someone who might be familiar to you, or it might be a UPS tracking number that says, here, click on this link or this attachment, and then you do it, and maybe it asks you to enter your password, and then with a stolen password, a hacker uses that to breach your organization. Or perhaps you've clicked on a link or attachment that inadvertently downloaded malware onto your machine. So this is how China was doing it when we first started covering these attacks those many years ago. When they reemerged under the Trump organization, they did so in a way that showed that they had actually spent a lot of that downtime investing in a total reorganization of their cyber operations. They basically moved a lot of their operations away from the PLA under the Ministry of State Security, which is their equivalent of the NSA. And a lot of the operations we've seen since haven't been in the form of spear phishing. They've used very sophisticated methods to break into Microsoft Exchange systems, VPNs, and that is what we have just seen over the last year. We've seen a number of attacks that use vulnerabilities in Microsoft systems and even some security software to leverage those holes to break into organizations. So the other thing that's been happening is Russia. You know, when I first started covering these attacks, Russia was big as a host for cybercrime, and they continue to be, and we're seeing that right now with ransomware. But it was very interesting. After Stuxnet, Russia actually started hankering for a bilateral cyber weapons treaty with the United States. I think the thinking goes, I should say, is that once they saw what Stuxnet could do, and they realized Russia was behind in this space, they worried about what the United States could do, and they worried about being behind, and they wanted to set up some kind of treaty. Now, the United States would never agree to that kind of treaty with Russia, because the history of Russia hacking is that Russia outsources a lot of its hacking to cyber criminals. We've seen this in an attack at Yahoo a couple years ago, where the way it worked, at least according to the indictment that came out several years later, was that it was 4 guys. 2 of them were members of the FSB and 2 of them were cyber criminals. And the way it worked is that the FSB let cyber criminals break into Yahoo, steal usernames and passwords, and sell those credentials on the dark web, where they can make a pretty penny. But if they found an account that belonged to someone who worked at the White House or the State Department, they would pass that on to the FSB. So part of the challenge, the United States intelligence officials say and defense officials say, is how do you deal with an adversary that's not just a nation state actor, but outsources this activity to private citizens? And that has been one of the biggest challenges we've had with ransomware, because we believe that if Putin said one day, cut it out, then we would see ransomware drop off significantly. But instead, Russia has basically tacitly enabled it, if not encouraged it, by giving immunity to a lot of the cyber criminals who conduct these ransomware attacks. And one of the things we see with ransomware, just in the code, is that the first thing ransomware will do is search your computer for its default language setting. And if it sees that your default language setting is Russian, it will actually move right along. It will not infect you. And we think that's all part of this tacit agreement that cyber criminals and the Kremlin have, whereby cyber criminals can act with relative immunity so long as they're not hacking targets inside Russia. And then there are new players. So about 2 years after Stuxnet was discovered, and I should mention that at the time Stuxnet was unleashed on Natanz, Iran had basically no hacking capabilities to speak of. Any kind of hacking capabilities they had was really directed at surveilling their own citizens. But after Stuxnet, really opened up the world's eyes to the potential of cyber attacks for this kind of destruction, we witnessed an attack on Saudi Aramco, world's richest oil company based in Saudi Arabia, US ally, Iranian enemy, whereby hackers used code to decimate the data on some 30,000 Aramco computers. And it didn't just decimate it, it actually replaced it with an image of a burning American flag. And we think that was really Iran's way of saying, hello, we've joined the scene. And that really blew American officials' minds. I was actually one of several journalists who had privileged access to a couple of the Snowden documents. And among the documents that I was able to read was a national intelligence estimate that same year, 2012, and this was before the Aramco attack, that said that they thought that while countries like Iran and North Korea would have the will to do the United States harm using cyber capabilities, they still lacked the skills to do so. And what the attack on Saudi Aramco showed us, and it was ultimately tied directly back to hackers in Iran, what it showed us was that actually they were able to pull off the skills and know-how to conduct a destructive attack like that in a much quicker time frame than the US gave them credit for. And also they didn't need a Stuxnet level cyber weapon to do harm. They could actually do just as much harm potentially with rudimentary code whose only command was just to wipe a system clean and replace it with an image. I should also mention North Korea, which many of you are probably familiar with Sony, the attack on Sony a few years ago, where Kim Jong-un was upset with something that was in this James Franco, Seth Rogen film that portrayed his assassination. And North Korean hackers launched an attack on Sony Pictures that decimated its data on 70% of its servers. Only it was a little bit of a twist on the Saudi Aramco attack. It didn't just decimate data or replace it. They actually took the data that they wiped out before they wiped it out and leaked it online. And many of us will remember what happened next. They leaked Sony executive emails, and journalists everywhere pounced on those emails and covered it. And we all heard a lot about gender pay gap and what Sony executives were saying about Adam Sandler movies and Angelina Jolie. But we heard a little bit less about the fact that this was a big wake-up call for the US government that North Korea had now acquired the skills to pull off this level of attack, or to see that there was a very disturbing through line here in all of these attacks, which was that not only were our adversaries acquiring the capabilities to pull off this level of destruction, but each attack seemed to be sort of a little bit of an escalation of the playbook from the previous attack. So, after Stuxnet, we saw the Iranian attack on Saudi Aramco. The North Korea attack was a slight escalation. And 1 year later, we saw the Russian hack on the DNC, where Russian hackers started leaking out the DNC's emails, and we all know what happened next. So I mention all of this to just say that this has been my life for the last 10 years. I have been running from attack to attack, and the one consistent theme is that these attacks are coming from different disparate corners of the globe. They're increasing in frequency, they're increasing in sophistication. And I wanted to know, where is the cavalry? Who is doing anything about this? And I'll tell you that when the FBI came to the New York Times during our breach, you had this feeling as a journalist or even just a private citizen of, okay, we're giving them the log files, we're telling them everything that we're seeing on our network. Okay, so who is it? When are you going to go get these guys? But instead, the FBI said, thank you very much. They closed their binders, they waved goodbye, and we never heard from them again. And that has been the story of so many organizations that have been breached over the last 10 years. No one has essentially come to save them. Very rarely do you see indictments of these actors. And if you do have indictments, it's rarer still that any of those hackers see the inside of a jail cell, because so much of it comes from China or Russia, or these countries that would never extradite these hackers to the United States. So we're left with this strange world where we're just hoping that one of these hackers goes to the Maldives for vacation where we can pick them up there. And so one of the basic questions I kept asking is, what is the United States government doing about this? How are they going to keep us safe? And what I learned was that this was a very complex question. So one of the things is that the US doesn't actually control .com, right? They only protect .gov and .mil. And actually, of critical infrastructure in the United States, only 15% of it is owned and secured by the US government. The rest of it is in private sector hands. And when Congress has tried to regulate this issue, when they have tried to pass a bill that would require that just critical infrastructure operators, water treatment facilities, pipeline operators, utility companies, railways, aviation, when they've tried to regulate that those companies meet a bare minimum standard of cybersecurity, the lobbyists have always come in and they said, no way, this is too expensive and too burdensome on the private sector. So we have never actually been able to see the passage of a cybersecurity bill. Any legislation that has come down has come in the form of an executive order, first under Obama and Trump, and most recently under Biden. But for the most part, these executive orders end up being sort of a list of best practices. Here is what we really wish that you would be doing. It's all voluntary. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the Biden executive order in a minute, but it was very clear that everyone was basically left to deal with this problem on their own. And there was something else here. And I'd covered it in very disparate incremental form in the pages of the New York Times, but this ended up being why I wrote my book. So I'll ask my second poll question right now, and I apologize. It's very bright right now where I am. The sun is streaming in, and so it's about 5 p.m. here on the West Coast. So I apologize if you're having trouble seeing me. But I'll present my second poll question, which is, how many of you are familiar with the term 0 day? I'll just give you a minute to answer that one. Okay, the majority of you say no, but actually 9 of you say you are familiar, you've heard of a 0 day, which is actually quite impressive. So a 0 day, for the unindoctrinated, is a hole in software that the software manufacturer is not aware of. So let's just take the simplest example, and I promise this is the most technical thing I'll tell you in this talk today. A 0 day is, let's say I'm a hacker and I find a flaw in your iPhone's iOS software that Apple doesn't know about. That's called a 0 day, because the day Apple learns about it, they've had 0 days to fix it. They'll try and fix it in as quickly as they can. They'll get a patch out, they'll put that patch in your software updates. You'll get an annoying prompt to update your software, and then the hole goes away. And that's why, by the way, it's very important to update your software in a timely manner. But so a 0 day is basically this hole in the software, and I'm a hacker and I can develop a program to exploit that iPhone 0 day. I could potentially write a program that could read your text messages, track your location, record your phone calls, turn on your camera, check your contacts, et cetera, et cetera. What else would a spy agency really want or need? So the going rate actually for that 0 day exploit, if you live in the United States and you want to sell it to a broker who sells it to governments, there is a broker outside the Beltway who advertises on their website that they'll pay you $2.5 million for that program, on the condition that you never tell a soul about that 0 day, because the minute Apple finds out about it, they patch it, it goes to dust, right? Brokers in the United States, for a long time, I'd heard murmurings that there was a market for these capabilities, that there were brokers out there that were willing to pay hackers hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars potentially, for these 0 day exploits, on the condition that they never speak about them and that they would sell them to government agencies. This has always been a rumor, and there'd been some thin reporting on it. And this is called the 0-day market. And I joke in my book that it's like Fight Club. If you've ever seen the movie Fight Club, the first rule of the 0-day market is nobody talks about the 0-day market. And the second rule of the 0-day market is nobody talks about the 0-day market. But we'd had some thin reporting over the years. The United States government was one of the biggest buyers of these 0-day exploits. They were the biggest sponsor of this market. And I set out to find out if that was true, because to me, this created not just a moral dilemma, but a huge security dilemma. I just could not wrap my head around the fact that we, the US taxpayer, pay the government to keep us safe. But when it comes to our cybersecurity, the government was acquiring or finding these 0 days and widely used software, not so they could get it patched and fix the software, but so that they could potentially leverage it in their own counterintelligence operations, their own counterterrorism operations, or potentially in their own battlefield preparations in case they wanted to pull off the equivalent of Stuxnet on a rainy day. And the problem with this was that, maybe 20 years ago, which is when I learned that this began in the 90s, we were all using different software. Russians were using one form of software, China was using another, we were using something else. That was no longer the case. We were all now using iPhones and Android phones, and whether you own a PC or not, you rely on Microsoft Windows software at your water treatment facility, at the grid, aviation, et cetera, et cetera. So when the US government would leave a hole open in the software baked into those systems, it wasn't just leaving it open for itself so it could break into these systems overseas. It was leaving it open for all of these adversaries that were increasingly creeping into my life and the cybersecurity threat landscape to exploit on Americans. And the other thing was that the stakes for these decisions was only getting higher the more that we baked this software into our most critical infrastructure. And so that is why I set out to write a book on the history of the 0-day market, which I hope you will read. It's called This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. But the conclusion of it is this. The conclusion of it is that for a long time, the US government and now other governments all over the globe have been making trade-offs of our cybersecurity in the name of national security without realizing that the two have become one in the same. And the reason I wrote the book was basically to drag this conversation out into the open so Americans would realize the trade-offs that are being done in the name of this old thinking about national security. Now, my book came out in February, and one of the first things that happened after the book came out was a hack of a water treatment facility in Oldsmar, Florida. So Oldsmar, Florida, small town outside Tampa, just the Friday, just ahead of the Super Bowl in Tampa this year, someone hacked into that water treatment facility using a flaw in Microsoft Windows software and exploiting the fact that this water treatment facility did not have multi-factor authentication turned on. And they used the access that they got to access the chemical controls at the water treatment facility and up the level of lye in the water, that's LYE, to the point that they could have badly poisoned this entire population outside Tampa ahead of Super Bowl Sunday, had an engineer not been sitting on his screen and without his hand moving, watched as his cursor moved across the screen into the chemical controls. The other thing that has happened since my book came out is ransomware. Now, ransomware has been going on for years, but thanks to the advent of cryptocurrency, most cyber criminals who a decade ago were engaged in pharmaceutical scams and selling your identity and personal data on the dark web have now moved on to ransomware. Because what they're doing is they're just able to exploit these simple vulnerabilities in the software we all now have come to rely on and become so dependent on or stolen passwords, or the lack of two-factor authentication, or the fact that you might not have updated your software to the latest, greatest version of Windows or iOS to deploy ransomware, and they're very successful at it. And what we've seen is the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, on JBS, on software companies. And we've all seen the visuals of people basically stuck in line for blocks trying to get gas, panic buying at the pump. We saw nonstop flights get grounded because of that attack. At one point, my colleagues and I got our hands on a classified Department of Energy assessment that found that the United States could only actually afford 2 more days of downtime from the Colonial Pipeline attack before our entire economy ground to a halt, largely actually because Colonial Pipeline is the main conduit for diesel, and diesel is still required for a lot of these chemical refineries. So in some way, that attack sounded like almost a terrorist attack. The way it worked was that Colonial Pipeline had an old employee account that they never deactivated and that they never had protected with two-factor authentication. And that's all it took to basically shut down the main conduit for gas and jet fuel and diesel to the East Coast. And unfortunately, that attack was a little bit of a blessing in disguise in my eyes, because I think it finally gave a visual element to this vast ocean of cyber threats I had been covering over the last 10 years. It also, prompted Americans to start asking these questions I've been asking for more than a decade, like, why are we so vulnerable? What are we doing about this? What is the US government doing about this? What can we do about this? How do we raise the bar for cybersecurity in the United States? And that is a good thing. That is a blessing in disguise. Now, the other thing I failed to mention was that when I started writing my book about the zero-day market, I was asking all sorts of questions like, which hackers do we buy these 0 days from? And will we buy 0 days in certain systems and not others? Will hackers promise not to sell these tools twice, not just to US government agencies, but potentially to the UAE or the Saudis that might use it to hack a dissident or a journalist? Will they sell it to Iran or our adversaries in Russia? But the one thing I never considered when I first started writing this book is that one day someone might hack our own government stockpile of 0 days. But unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. And many missed it. I covered this on the front pages of the New York Times, but unfortunately, many missed it because there was a lot going on. But in August 2016, someone who called themselves the Shadow Brokers showed up on Twitter and claimed that they had hacked the NSA. And at first, no one believed them, but over a period of several months, they started dribbling out some of the NSA's best kept zero-day exploits and tools. And in early 2017, they dropped the mother load. They dropped some of the NSA's most coveted zero-day exploits that were used against Microsoft Windows systems that could automate an attack on Microsoft Windows systems. And shortly after that, North Korea picked up the NSA's tools for a global ransomware attack that some called WannaCry. Fortunately, they were sloppy with their code, and someone was actually able to neutralize that attack pretty quickly. But a month later, Russia picked up the NSA's stolen zero-day exploits, and they baked it into an attack on Ukraine. And the attack was designed to look like ransomware, but it actually wasn't ransomware at all. There was no way for victims to actually pay the ransom to get their data back. It was actually just an effort to destroy data and paralyze data in Ukraine. And unfortunately, it didn't just hit Ukraine, it zoomed around the world, just like Stuxnet had so many years earlier, and infected corporations all over the world that had even a single employee working remotely from Ukraine. So that brings me to my third question which was which of the following organizations were collateral damage in that attack using the NSA's stolen zero-day exploits? Yep, all of the above. FedEx suffered just under $500 million in damages from that attack. Merck was paralyzed in that attack. I think they were, the damages were upwards of $500 million. Pfizer, same thing. Merck actually, because of that attack using stolen NSA tools, it disrupted their vaccine supply chain that year. And Merck actually had to tap into the CDC's emergency supplies of the Gardasil vaccine that year because their vaccine production systems were disrupted in that attack. A Cadbury egg chocolate factory in Tasmania was hit and pulled offline, which I always mention just to give people a sense of just how interconnected these systems are. Chernobyl, the old nuclear site, the radiation monitoring system was destroyed in that attack. And so engineers actually had to go out with handheld Geiger counters and radiation monitors over the old exclusion zone at Chernobyl. And so all of these things were hit. And for American companies, many of the victims had cyber insurance. But when they went to go claim damages, the insurers said, sorry, not so fast. See here in the fine print, we actually have a war exemption, and we are going to argue that you were collateral damage in Russia's larger war on Ukraine. So we don't actually have to pay these damages out. And to this day, none of the victims of this Russian attack on Ukraine using stolen NSA tools have ever been able to get money back for those damages. And so I talk about that attack quite a bit because it illustrates a few things. One, just how connected we all are on the internet. Too often we still think of the United States as a protected island, protected by two distinct oceans, when on the internet, that's just no longer the case. The other is that this was an attack using stolen NSA zero-day exploits. So for years, just these zero-day exploits show that the NSA had stockpiled vulnerabilities, these 0 days, in the most widely used software there is, Microsoft Windows, for its own purposes. And not only did it hold on to them for more than 5 years, it actually let them get out. We still don't know who the shadow brokers are. We still don't know who hacked the NSA. We still don't know if they still have access to the NSA systems. This is the world's premier intelligence agency. And we've learned that even they can't keep these tools safe. And I also mention it just to say that, I think, and this is my closing comment tonight, I think that the United States, and I don't like sounding falsely patriotic when I say this, but I think that the United States is still the top dog when it comes to offensive cyber capabilities. Nobody has pulled off anything close to Stuxnet over the last 10 years since that attack was leaked, but they're getting closer. I mentioned the Russian attack. Well, they've also turned off the lights twice in Ukraine. Just a couple of years ago, we caught some attackers break into a Saudi petrochemical facility and use 0 days in Schneider Electric software, which is the same software we use here in our critical infrastructure. And they used a series of 0 days in Schneider Electric software to dismantle the safety locks at that plant, which is essentially the very last thing you would do before triggering some kind of explosion. And given the target, a Saudi oil company, petrochemical facility, the initial suspect was Iran, just given that their hack on Saudi Aramco and their hacks of Saudi oil companies, which never stopped, by the way. But it took a year until we discovered that no, actually that attack was the work of a graduate research university in Moscow. And so we've seen our adversaries really catch up over and over again in ways that we never gave them credit for. And yet our thinking around offense versus defense and the balance between the two hasn't changed. We are still stockpiling 0 days in widely used software to this day. The the other thing is that, it doesn't really matter that you're the world's top dog on offense and cyber offense, because clearly it's not a deterrent. Unfortunately, the old nuclear analogies do not suffice here. Our own stockpile of these tools, of Stuxnet-like capabilities, has not deterred our nation state enemies or cyber criminals from hacking our most critical systems. The Department of Justice and the FBI actually just recently declassified a report about Chinese hacks of American pipelines that have been going for the last decade. And they said that they declassified their conclusion that they believe these attacks were not IP theft, which is what we initially believed them to be. These were battlefield preparation. This was Chinese hackers embedding themselves in American pipelines in the event they might need to turn them off, in the same way that we saw a group of cyber criminals shut down Colonial Pipeline the other month. And so not only is offense not a deterrent, I think that the next major geopolitical conflict, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that I think the next major geopolitical conflict will involve at least some cyber component, if not a major cyber component. And I think the country that wins that conflict will look a lot like a digital Israel, a country that can basically continue to run its most basic functions and services despite being surrounded by hostile activity. And unfortunately, the reality is that the United States is still not that country. We would lose that conflict. So long as you can turn off a major pipeline because that operator didn't have two-factor authentication installed, or they hadn't deactivated an old employee account, we will continue to lose those conflicts. And so I say all this today not to terrify you, but just because I think the first step in coming up with solutions is to be aware of the problem. And so I hope that this made you aware of the problem. And I'm happy to talk through various solutions. I'm happy to answer your questions. I've covered a lot, but I'm out of time. So why don't we go to audience questions, and I will answer anything, no matter how silly it sounds. In this space, I will tell you how I've dealt with my own paranoia, how I protect myself, what I tell my mother, or anything you want to know.
Well, thank you, Nicole. We only have a few questions so far. The first one is rather long, so bear with me. The US, this is from Lloyd Barrety. The US dropped atomic weapons on Japan during World War II, ostensibly to jolt the enemy to surrender. You suggested that the US government does not appear to be doing enough to fight the perpetrators of cyber attacks. How would you feel if the US government were to stage a devastating attack on a bad actor country to set an example and potentially scare others from attacking the US entities? Even if it served as a deterrent for only some months or years, would it be worthwhile? And or would it perhaps educate enemies on our capabilities such that they could copy it and use it against us?
Great question. And unfortunately, this isn't even a hypothetical. So after the Russian interference in 2016, one of the things my colleague David Sanger and I learned was that, and I should back up and just say that during the Obama administration, President Obama required that he sign off on any cyber attack, on any major offensive cyber operation. That rule disappeared under Trump. We don't know exactly when, but at some point the reins were loosened, and US Cyber Command, which is the major hacking operation at the Pentagon, was able to conduct these attacks without presidential approval. So at some point, my colleague David Sanger and I learned that the rules had been changed, and that US Cyber Command had used the leeway to start hacking the Russian grid, and that they were making a loud show of it. And this is what I call mutually assured digital destruction, or an effort towards mutually assured digital destruction. And in fact, we put this story together, we ran it by numerous sources, and then we called the National Security Council. And I assumed we would be in for a very painful conversation where they would tell us that we would have blood on our hands if we reported this story about the US essentially hacking the Russian power grid as a show of strength and potentially a deterrent to any other future operation, like the attacks that Russia was doing in Ukraine. And instead of a painful conversation, what the National Security Council said to us was, we have no problem with you writing about these attacks. In other words, they were hoping that Russia would know that the United States was hacking the Russian grid and embedding itself there so that Russia might think twice before conducting some of these operations that they had done in Ukraine, like shut the power down. And we wrote about this and we said, this raises very difficult, disturbing questions about the fact that the US is essentially in this strategy legitimizing the hack of civilian systems like the power grid as a form of deterrence in the cyberspace. But I don't know whether that's actually been a deterrent. I think the only way you would know is if you were a fly on Vladimir Putin's wall. And maybe that's why Russia hasn't pulled off something more significant in terms of a direct state-directed operation on the United States. Maybe that's why they were playing around with the safety locks at a petrochemical facility in Saudi Arabia, not in the United States, although I've caught them and I've written about Russian groups hacking nuclear plants in the United States and utilities and oil companies. Maybe that's why the Kremlin didn't go further in terms of election interference in 2020. We really don't know. But I think it's very scary that this is sort of the low-level daily escalation we find ourselves in, and that most people are totally oblivious to. And yes, we are educating our enemies as we legitimize these targets for nation state attacks like the Stuxnet attack, like the attack on the Russian grid. We are also basically saying to our enemies, sorry, there's a very loud plane over my head right now. We're also basically saying to our enemies that they have free rein to do the same. And I don't know where this all ends. But I definitely think what's clear from the Shadow Brokers hack is that yes, these tools and capabilities can be emulated. These are not nuclear weapons. You do not need fissile material to pull off these attacks. You just need a laptop and skills. And if you don't have them, there is now a market that has crept up to meet your demand. I should mention that there is, this broker around the Beltway who will advertise $2.5 million for that zero-day exploit I described earlier. Well, now there's a broker in Abu Dhabi who's advertising $3 million for that same capability. So we're already getting outbid here. So this is the question I want everyone to be asking, which is, are these really deterrents, or are we in this endless cycle of escalation? And, by the way, a lot of these tools are boomeranging back on the United States. And we need to have a national conversation about the trade-offs we've been making, because ultimately, I think it's inevitable that they will come boomeranging back on the United States, just like they've already done with the attack I mentioned earlier on FedEx and Merck and Pfizer and others.
Okay, thanks. So from Michael Best, describe Estonia's approach to insulate their internet from external attack.
So Estonia, they invested heavily in authentication and in basically, moving to a system of encryption and authentication because they could see, and they were the target of the first major destructive attack. There was an attack, I'm blanking on the year here, but I think it was around 2008 and it predated Stuxnet. Maybe it was 2007. When Russia was upset about the removal of an old Soviet statue, or patriotic Russian hackers were upset about it. And they launched a denial of service attack on Estonia that really badly took out their systems for a number of days. And so after that, what Estonia's president did was he basically ripped out Estonia's old forms of authentication, such as we have here, like social security numbers and such. And he basically developed a digital form of authentication and made sure that they encrypted every link in the chain, so that people could sort of verify that they are who they say they are and that their credentials can't be used to break into a major Estonian critical infrastructure operator. But then there are still questions about whether this only created a more complex, larger attack surface for a very industrious and persistent and advanced enemy. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but I do think there are very good lessons to be learned from Estonia. Estonia has the benefit of having been an early, the first target of one of these destructive attacks, and to have Russia as a neighbor breathing down its neck, and its citizens and its businesses and its government act accordingly. And unfortunately, we don't have that here. We are still sort of operating pretty obliviously to the cyber threat landscape. And, unfortunately, solving this, and this kind of gets to one of these other questions, what is my solution? Unfortunately, unlike in other countries, we can't just wave a fist and say, you will secure yourselves. Like I mentioned earlier, 85% of our most critical systems are owned by the private sector. They can invest in security, or they can take that dollar that they would invest on security and invest it in a new product or a new service. And more often than not, they choose the new product or service. And, also security really comes down, they say it comes down to the individual. They say you're only as secure as your weakest link. And all too often it's people, it's us, it's individuals who end up being the weak links because we use a bad password, or we don't have two-factor authentication turned on, or we click on a phishing email, or we're not updating our software. And sometimes that's all it takes to break into Google or the New York Times. And those are the stories I tell over and over again in my book. So, in terms of solutions, I think one of them is just we need to wake up. We need to wake up to these threats. We are, unfortunately, now one of the most targeted nation states on earth. And we are also arguably one of the most vulnerable, which is so counterintuitive to most Americans, but we are one of the most vulnerable because we are so automated and because we've just been baking software into everything we possibly can, asking ourselves, can we do this instead of should we do this? And so my solutions are awareness. My solutions are probably regulation that mandates that critical infrastructure operators meet this bare minimum standard of cybersecurity. The other things are, should we be baking this software into airplanes, weapon delivery systems, railways, water treatment facilities? Should someone have remote access to the chemical controls at the Oldsmar, Florida water treatment plant? I don't think so. I don't think that we actually need that level of convenience. I think that it's time to perhaps start ripping out software from those systems, or doing inventory checks of those systems to make sure that they aren't using outdated software, or that they don't have a server hanging out there on the internet. And then the other thing is, we have a huge cybersecurity talent shortage in this country. We have 500,000 cybersecurity vacancies in this country. And or it might be global, sorry, I have to check my math. But unfortunately, we can't just staff those jobs. Most engineers that would be perfect candidates for a job at the Department of Homeland Security's new cybersecurity agency have plenty of other lucrative job opportunities to go work at Facebook or Palantir or Google or Microsoft, where they can still work on really exciting cybersecurity challenges, and they don't have to deal with the bureaucracy and the red tape and lower salaries. And so we have this huge talent shortage. Other countries, particularly our adversaries, have figured this out. And the way that they've solved for this is that Russia will tap cyber criminals for some of its sensitive operations. China increasingly taps this loose network of contractors for some of its sensitive operations. And it gives them a level of plausible deniability for these attacks that we don't have here. But we don't do that in a free market society. We don't go tap the top security engineer at Google on the shoulder at night and say, hey, tonight you're moonlighting with us. So we're at a real disadvantage just from a talent and defense perspective. And when we do have scholarship programs that recruit talent into government in exchange for paying their school tuition, a lot of the best and brightest want to go work at the NSA on offense, or they want to go work at Cyber Command. And who could blame them? I say in the book, it's always been more fun to be a pirate than be in the Coast Guard. So most of the best and brightest go work on offense. And it's really hard to get good people to work on defense. And so one of the solutions I come up with in the book is perhaps establishing some tours of duty where maybe companies like Microsoft or Palantir or Google would loan out and subsidize the salaries of some of their employees to go work at companies that operate US critical infrastructure like water treatment facilities, and for a year work there and try and bring their cybersecurity up to snuff. But that's considered radical right now in our economy. But those are just some of them. What do I tell my mom she needs to do? Well, I wrote this book for my mom because my mom is constantly asking me how to save a photo that she gets texted and calling me in the middle of the day while I'm dealing with these nation state attacks. So what I tell her is use a password manager if you can. All of your passwords have been stolen. I don't care how clever you are. I thought I was clever too. They've all been stolen. Hackers have these dictionaries that they automate, that they throw at your account, and it's almost inevitable that if they don't already have your password, that they will crack it. So use a password manager. Turn on two-factor authentication. It only takes 15 seconds wherever you can, but definitely on your email account and on your bank account and on your social media accounts if you can, especially now that we use Facebook to log into so many other systems. Turn on two-factor authentication right after this Zoom on those systems, and that will make you 99% more secure than everyone else out there. And finally, don't click on links or attachments from people who you don't know. Don't do it on your phone. Don't do it in your email. If you do get a link from a friend, just hover over their email address to make sure it's actually theirs. And finally, update your software. Just, if you can figure it out, go to your desktop software and click the option that lets you automatically update your software every time a new software update is available, or just update it every time you get one of those annoying prompts. And if you do that, you will be better off. I always say perfect security is a pipe dream. The name of the game is really just be a little bit more secure than the next guy, so that hackers, won't bother wasting the time and energy on you, that they can just as easily get that same information from someone else. Let's see.
Maybe I can ask a question if I just, your reporting and raising awareness within our government, are they responding in some way, or are they changing any of their approaches to improve the situation?
Yeah, so one of the greatest honors, I guess I should say, but I don't think I can do it while I'm a journalist, is I was asked to consider maybe joining as an advisor to the government to help put some of these solutions in place. I've heard from a lot of people inside NSA even who say thank you for articulating what I long knew to be a huge imbalance between offense and defense in this country, but haven't been able to put into words. But the best thing that has happened was with this Biden cyber executive order that I promised to return to and never did. Biden has put in place the best people for the jobs, but they face immense structural challenges. So one of my favorite quotes in my book is this, and I'll get the score wrong, but it said something like, if we were to score cyber in the United States, like we do a soccer game, the score would be something like 452 to 469 20 minutes into the game. In other words, it's all offense all the time, and we barely put in a goalie. And the guy who said that quote is Chris Inglis, who was just nominated and approved, confirmed to be our first national cybersecurity director. So he spent his entire career at NSA. And here he is saying, we need to start thinking about defense in a meaningful way. And now he's in charge. So, I have faith that he knows what we need to do to get done. Unfortunately, we have serious challenges in terms of getting regulation passed. So one of the things that the executive order did was it said, okay, we are going to come up with these standards. And there are things like all the things I mentioned earlier, like turn on multi-factor authentication and don't use outdated software. And we are going to tell federal contractors and federal agencies, because that's all we have control over is federal agencies, really, is that they have to meet this bare minimum standard of cybersecurity. For contractors who we have a little less control over, we're actually going to use the power of the purse. And we're going to rip out the red tape and let them self-certify that they meet these NIST standards. But if we catch them lying to us, this is what the executive order says, not in these words. It says, if we catch you lying to us, you're banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. That is the first stick we've ever seen in this country on cybersecurity, and it's a very important one. And I've been fielding a lot of calls from people who've been telling me how seriously this process and that executive order and that line in the executive order, how seriously that's being taken, not just by federal contractors, but finally by critical infrastructure operators who believe that ultimately that will be the regulation. And, when you think about Colonial Pipeline, if that executive order had been in place before the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, and they had self-certified that they were up to snuff, and then gotten hit with a ransomware attack, and it turned out, they didn't have two-factor authentication enabled, they'd be banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. Now, they service the entire East Coast, and at certain points, they butt up against federal systems. So that could potentially put them out of business. So this is a really important stick. And I hope one turning point among several that will get us back on track.
Okay, a question from Philip Oppenheimer. How do you, or does one find the source of the hack? What footprints are left?
It's a good one. I mean, one of the hardest things about a cyber attack is attribution. It's really easy to leave false flags, they call them, that would point to some other adversary. I mentioned the Russian attack on the Saudi petrochemical facility where we assumed it to be Iran. And it took a year before they were able to trace it back to this graduate research university outside Moscow. We've seen Russia actually hack into Iran's command and control servers that they use for attacks and use those servers to launch other attacks. So we see them not just messing around with capabilities in places like Ukraine, but messing around with attribution. And it's really tricky. Again, this is a space where nuclear analogies don't easily apply because it's very easy for someone to copy code from someone else or another attack group and use it for their own attack. And it can take months, in some cases years, to trace these attacks back. I mentioned the shadow brokers. We still don't know who hacked the NSA, which to me is the most stunning thing that's happened, the stunning story of national security of our time. So what do they use? I mean, oftentimes it's things like malware threads. They're only the most sophisticated adversaries are using completely unique code that has never been used anywhere else. That's been the very, very, very rare exception, like Stuxnet, like that attack on the Saudi petrochemical facility. Oftentimes the malware has shown up in previous attacks. That's something that we always see with North Korea attacks. For whatever reason, they keep using the same wiper code in a lot of these attacks. We look at IP addresses and what other activities those IP addresses, what other activity has been done on, from those IP addresses. They look at tool sets. They look at, if it's a phishing email, they look at, has the domain that was used to send this phishing email been used in previous attacks before, on and on and on. Unfortunately, the best of the best are not this sloppy, but most of the time, cyber criminals are just brazen. So they don't care that someone knows it's the dark side ransomware group in Russian. In fact, they take credit for it all the time on their blog. And a lot of times even nation states kind of continue to leave these traces. Now, the United States is different. Rarely do I cover sophisticated American attacks on other systems with these exceptions I've named today. That's not because I'm, hiding what the US is doing. That's just because the US is much better at leaving no trace and really using its capabilities wisely and investing heavily in unique tools and code that can't be traced back to other attacks. So it's all of these things, they always say it's more art than science. It's usually looking for patterns, just like you would with good old fashioned detective work and working your way back from there.
Okay, well, maybe now we had one more question. I'm trying to figure out which one. There's one from Frank Fitzmaurice about how are you in the New York Times? What are you doing to enhance your cybersecurity? And another one from Richard Signer, maybe. Is it possible to disconnect from the internet computers that control, for example, water treatment plants to prevent attacks? So I'll let you pick out whichever of those two questions you want to answer, and then we'll call it a night.
Oh, I know, and I'm sorry, this is a lot. So thank you for bearing with me. So what do I do? So this is important. Okay, this is what I do is the same advice I would give to everyone else. And so what I say is ask yourself, what are your crown jewels? What is the one thing that if someone hacked that thing or they wiped it, or they dumped it on the internet, it would be game over for you. So for me, it's my sources, right? It's my anonymous sources. That's who I have to rely on. Unfortunately, for a lot of these cybersecurity stories I do. So I protect them with my life. A couple of years ago, I kind of reached this fork in the road where someone, I'm moving around, but let me just say, a couple of years ago, I got this call from our security team at the New York Times. This answers both parts of your question. And they said, Nicole, bad news. Someone on the dark web is offering very good money to anyone who can hack your phone or your email account. And I realized, okay, I can either go live in a cabin off the grid in the woods and put on a tinfoil hat for the rest of my life, or I can protect my crown jewels, which are my phone, my email, and my really sensitive source communications, and do the best I can with everything else. So for my phone and my email account, I turn on two-factor authentication. I actually use a hardware key. It's like a hardware version of two-factor authentication called a YubiKey, YUBI. You can get it for something like $20 on Amazon, and I highly recommend you do it if you are at all a target, particularly of advanced nation state hacking threats. And then for sources, I just go offline. I have some sources, and it's gotten harder in the pandemic, that I would only meet at this restaurant on this day 3 times a year. I did not bring any devices. I did not drive because I worried about the navigation in my car being tracked. I don't take an Uber. I get dropped off or I walk there, and I bring a pen and paper. And that's the only way I feel like I can ever safely communicate with that source. So hopefully most of you don't have to go to those links to protect your crown jewels. But whatever it is, just invest your resources there. You're not going to be able to protect everything. So just invest in that one thing. And maybe that means taking it offline completely. And then for Richard's question, I think that leads us there, which is it possible to disconnect the internet's computers? Yes, it's called air gapping. And Iran's computer systems were air gapped. Natanz's systems were air gapped because there had been a long history of some kind of intrusions to Iran's Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. And so they took it offline. Now, it didn't stop someone from walking in, a spy, we still don't know who, with a USB stick, but that is like the most extreme example. I think the future will involve air gapping. It will involve making sure that our nuclear plants, maybe our hospitals, or pacemakers, it'll be tricky for a lot of it, but that a lot of them are not connected to any other network. Now, some of that's just impossible. So one of the sort of intermediary things are these things that are used a lot in Israel. There's like different companies who are the leaders in the space, but a major one is called Waterfall Security. And they sell these things that are basically advanced firewalls that only allow traffic to flow in one direction from these systems. So if Colonial Pipeline had Waterfall's device installed, they would not have had to shut down the pipeline. They would have been able to still capture data about gas outflows and charge their customers downstream without shutting down the pipeline. And they would have been able to be confident that no malware or ransomware would have been able to spread to the pipeline itself. And those are called, the fancy name is a unidirectional diode. And I think that's probably the future of critical infrastructure. The other thing is, when I looked around at like which countries are doing this very well, there was a study a couple of years ago that looked at the ratio of successful attacks on a country's networks versus total attempts. And it looked at it over the course of several years. And unfortunately, now it's dated, but Japan had not so great a ratio. And then over the course of a year, dramatically improved its ratio. And when researchers looked at the context for that improvement, they found that year they had Japan had rolled out a very comprehensive national cybersecurity policy that mentioned, it was the only policy at the time that mentioned the word air gapping, that said, we require that if you are these kinds of critical operations, you air gap your most critical systems from the rest of your networks. And that has served Japan quite well. And, unfortunately, Japan has this benefit of being neighbors with China and North Korea. So the threat for them is very real, not just for government and critical infrastructure, but for individuals. And they take cybersecurity rules and the threat very seriously. And that is, unfortunately, what we're still missing here, and part of the reason I wrote the book. So I'm sorry I'm not getting to the cryptocurrency question. I'll just say quickly about that. Cryptocurrency has really enabled ransomware. There's no doubt about that. When I first covered ransomware attacks so many years ago, it was go to your local pharmacy, get an e-gift card and turn over the PIN and give us $200 to unlock your computer. Now it's pay us $50 million in Monero cryptocurrency. And if you have to pay us in Bitcoin, we're going to charge you 20% premium on it. So there's no question it's enabled it. And I thought it was going to be, ransomware would be the Achilles heel for cryptocurrency, and governments would start bringing the hammer down. But then when the Department of Justice and FBI announced that they were able to claw back some of Colonial Pipeline's ransom payment, I talked to people who used to work at Treasury and are now working for these blockchain intelligence startups that track movement of payments along the blockchain and sell that intelligence back to government. And what they said to me was that it would have taken years of detective work to track that ransom payment back to some front company in the Seychelles. But now we can actually track these payments in real time. So in that sense, they're almost grateful for cryptocurrency that they're able to track these movements. But the question is, are they going to be able to scale that in a meaningful way that it would be a deterrent for ransomware groups? And I still think that's probably a big open question. So with that, I've taken up way too much of your time. Turn on two-factor authentication, and just thank you so much. I wish I could be there in person. I love the Berkshires, and I hope we can all meet in person one day.
Well, hopefully we'll invite you back. So Nicole, thank you so much. And I would just want to mention again, her book is called This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And Oblong Books has copies available. But anyway, thank you for joining us, Nicole. It was a fascinating talk. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining us as well. So we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Good night now.
Thank you. And I think after this, everyone deserves a little wine. So
It's already chilled and waiting.
all right. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you,
Good
everyone.
night.
Bye.